Money can buy you everything except the one thing that matters most, the truth about who really loves you. And for billionaire Harrison Blackwood, that truth was about to cost him everything he thought he knew about his own family. Picture this: a 72-year-old man worth over $3 billion, sitting alone in a mansion that spans 40,000 square feet, surrounded by priceless art, vintage wines, and the kind of silence that only wealth can buy. Harrison Blackwood built an empire from nothing. A portfolio of tech companies, real estate developments across 3 continents, and investment funds that moved markets with a single decision. He was the kind of man whose phone calls could make or break careers, whose signature on a contract meant generational wealth for everyone involved. But here's the thing about building an empire. You spend so much time constructing walls to protect your fortune that you forget you're also building walls around yourself. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed, not with a dramatic collapse or a devastating diagnosis, but with something far more insidious, a conversation he was never meant to hear. Harrison had returned home early from a board meeting, his footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that cost more than most people's homes. He was heading toward his study when he heard voices drifting from the parlor, his wife Sophia's laugh, light and carefree in a way she never was around him anymore, and his son Alexander's voice, confident and conspiratorial. Harrison paused at the doorway, hidden in shadow, and that's when the first crack appeared in his carefully constructed world. "Mother, he can't last forever," Alexander was saying, swirling what Harrison recognized as his 50-year-old scotch in a crystal glass. "The man's 72, barely sleeps, and his doctor's been warning him about his blood pressure for years. We need to be realistic about succession planning." Sophia's response was measured, calculated. "Darling, we must be patient. But yes, you're right. We need to be prepared. Once everything transfers, we can finally modernize this antiquated empire he's so stubbornly clinging to. The property portfolio alone could be liquidated for $2 billion minimum," Alexander interrupted, leaning forward with the kind of hunger that made Harrison's blood run cold. "And the tech companies? I've already had preliminary conversations with venture capitalists about a complete restructuring. Father's too old school, too risk-averse. Once I'm in control, we'll finally be free to do things properly." Free. That word hung in the air like poison gas, free from him, free to dismantle everything he'd built, free to finally live without the burden of his existence. Harrison stood frozen in that hallway, his hand gripping the doorframe as decades of his life suddenly refocused through a devastating new lens. Every family dinner where the conversation felt hollow. Every business decision his son had questioned a little too eagerly. Every time Sophia had suggested he take it easy or let the younger generation handle things. It all made terrible crystalline sense now. He didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, Harrison Blackwood did what he'd always done when faced with a problem. He retreated to his study, poured himself a drink he didn't taste, and began to think. The mahogany walls of his sanctuary, lined with first editions and photographs of business triumphs, suddenly felt less like monuments to success and more like a mausoleum for a life half-lived. His mind raced through the catalog of his relationships. When was the last time Sophia had touched his hand without wanting something? When had Alexander last asked about his life rather than his business? And what about Charlotte, his youngest? She called every Sunday, visited when she could, but was that love or obligation? The uncertainty was its own special torture, because if he'd been wrong about Sophia and Alexander, how could he trust his judgment about anyone? The clock on his desk ticked past midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2. Harrison sat in darkness, wrestling with a question that would have seemed absurd to the 25-year-old version of himself who'd mortgaged everything to start his first company. What is the point of building an empire if the people you built it for are just waiting for you to die? By morning, Harrison had made a decision. He'd spent his entire life solving problems through strategy, through calculated moves that revealed his opponent's true intentions. Why should this be any different? He would design a test, not the kind that destroyed, but the kind that illuminated. He would discover once and for all who in his family loved him for who he was and who loved him for what he could give them. His first call was to Dr. Raymond Maxwell, his physician for 20 years, and one of the few people Harrison actually trusted. They met at a cafe, far from Harrison's usual haunts, away from the eyes that always seemed to be watching men of his wealth. "You want me to do what?" Dr. Maxwell asked, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "Tell my family I'm dying," Harrison repeated, his voice steady despite the audacity of what he was proposing. "Terminal cancer. 6 months, maybe less. Make it believable." Dr. Maxwell set down his cup carefully, studying his patient's face. "Harrison, do you understand what you're asking? The psychological impact on your family." "The psychological impact?" Harrison's laugh was bitter. "Raymond, my family's already planning my funeral. They're picking out the flowers and dividing up the inheritance while I'm still breathing. I need to know the truth before I make decisions that will affect generations. I need to know who actually gives a damn about me versus who's counting down the days." The doctor was quiet for a long moment, ethical concerns warring with understanding on his face. "And if you're right, if they are just waiting for you to die, then I'll know who deserves to inherit what I've built. And more importantly, I'll know who doesn't." The second conspirator was easier to convince. Marcus Finch had been Harrison's attorney for 35 years, had helped him navigate hostile takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations, had drafted prenuptial agreements and trust documents that could fill a library. If anyone understood the cold mathematics of family wealth, it was Marcus. "It's elegant, in a terrible way," Marcus said, sitting across from Harrison in the leather chair that had witnessed countless deals. "A stress test for loyalty. Though I'll tell you right now, Harrison, you might not like what you discover." "I already don't like what I've discovered. This is about confirmation and consequence." Marcus nodded slowly, legal mind already working through the implications. "We'll need documentation. I'll create a medical directive, update beneficiary forms, all the paperwork that would naturally accompany a terminal diagnosis. It needs to feel real, look real. If anyone digs, the trail has to hold up." "Whatever it takes," Harrison said. "I want to see who they really are when they think I'm dying. I want to see if any of them actually care about me, or if I'm just a balance sheet they're waiting to liquidate." 3 days later, Harrison gathered his family in the formal dining room, a space usually reserved for important dinners with investors or politicians. Sophia arrived in a dove-gray dress that cost more than most cars. Alexander came straight from the office, his tie loosened but his ambition still tightly wound. And Charlotte, his youngest, who'd dropped everything to drive 3 hours from her modest apartment upstate when she heard her father had something urgent to discuss. The differences in their arrivals told their own story, but Harrison was about to conduct a much more revealing experiment. "I have cancer," he said simply, watching their faces with the same analytical precision he'd once used to read boardrooms and negotiate deals. "Dr. Maxwell discovered it 3 weeks ago, stage 4, pancreatic. He gives me 6 months, perhaps less." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, her face draining of color in a performance that would have been Oscar-worthy if Harrison didn't know better. Alexander stood frozen, his expression cycling through shock, calculation, and something that might have been grief but looked suspiciously like mental arithmetic. Charlotte simply started crying, her reaction immediate and visceral and real. "Dad, no. There has to be something. Treatments? Specialists?" She was already moving toward him, reaching for his hands. And in that moment, watching his 3 family members react to the news of his impending death, Harrison Blackwood's test began in earnest. The trap was set. The performance had commenced. And, somewhere in the wings of this domestic theater, the truth was waiting to make its entrance. But here's the question that should haunt anyone watching this story unfold. If you had billions of dollars and suspected your family was just waiting for you to die, would you have the courage to find out the truth? And more importantly, could you handle what that truth might reveal? Here's the terrifying truth about testing the people you love. Once you start, there's no going back. You can't unsee what they reveal. You can't unhear the words they say when they think you're too weak to matter anymore. And for Harrison Blackwood, the test he'd designed was about to show him a version of his family that would make that overheard conversation seem like a mercy. The performance began immediately. Dr. Maxwell had been thorough. Harrison now had prescription bottles lining his bathroom counter, medical equipment staged in a corner of his bedroom, and a care schedule that looked devastatingly real. He'd even lost weight intentionally over the past 3 weeks, stopped his morning runs, and cultivated the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent questioning everything you thought you knew about your life. The first night after the announcement, Sophia slept in the guest room. "I can't bear to watch you suffer," she'd said, her hand briefly touching his shoulder in what was meant to be a gesture of comfort, but felt more like a dismissal. "I need to keep my strength up to support you through this." Support. The word tasted like ash in Harrison's mouth as he lay alone in their king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long it had been since his wife had actually wanted to share a room with him. Was it months? Years? Had he been so consumed with building his empire that he'd missed the moment when his marriage became nothing more than a business arrangement with sentiment as the only currency? Alexander's response was even more telling. Within 24 hours of the announcement, he'd called an emergency board meeting without Harrison. "Dad needs to rest," he'd explained to Marcus Finch, who'd immediately reported back. "It's time I stepped up and took some of the burden off his shoulders. He'd want the company in good hands." Good hands. As if Harrison's hands had suddenly become incompetent the moment cancer was mentioned, as if 72 years of life experience and 50 years of business acumen evaporated with a single diagnosis. But Charlotte was different. She'd canceled her entire week, moved into one of the guest rooms, and appointed herself her father's primary caregiver. She was the one who brought him breakfast in bed, who sat with him during the afternoon when the house fell silent, who held his hand when he pretended the pain was too much to bear. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad," she'd whispered that first night, sitting beside his bed long after everyone else had retreated to their separate corners of the mansion. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it, I'm here." And Harrison, playing his role as the dying patriarch, had squeezed her hand and wondered if he'd been wrong, if perhaps love wasn't extinct in his family after all, if maybe, just maybe, he'd misjudged everything. But then came week 2, and the mask began to slip. Harrison had always been a student of human behavior. You don't build a $3 billion empire without learning to read people, to see the calculation behind the smile, to hear what's not being said in every negotiation. Now, confined to his bedroom and the study, playing the role of the declining patriarch, he watched his family with the same analytical precision he'd once reserved for hostile takeover attempts. Sophia's visits became a predictable pattern. Every morning at 9, she'd appear in his doorway, perfectly composed, asking about his night with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for hotel concierges, inquiring about your stay. The conversations lasted exactly 7 minutes. Harrison had timed them before she found an excuse to leave. Charity board meetings, lunch appointments, spa treatments that were essential for managing the stress. But the interesting part wasn't what Sophia did during those 7-minute visits. It was what she did when she thought Harrison was sleeping. He'd started pretending to doze off in his study, his breathing deep and regular, while she moved through the house like a ghost with a purpose. And that's when he saw her, standing in the doorway of his home office, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but not quite low enough. "Marcus, I don't care what the trust documents say," she'd hissed during one such call. "There has to be a way to ensure liquidity. The Hamptons property alone is worth $40 million. If we position it correctly, we could have it on the market by—" She'd stopped mid-sentence, glancing toward where Harrison appeared to be sleeping, then continued in an even lower whisper. "Just tell me what needs to be done. I want to be prepared." Prepared. Not grieving, not devastated. Prepared. Harrison had felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with his fictional cancer. This was the woman he'd built a life with, the woman who'd stood beside him for 43 years, and she was already liquidating their shared memories before his fictional corpse was even cold. If Sophia's betrayal was cold calculation, Alexander's was burning ambition wrapped in the thinnest veneer of filial concern. By week 3, his son had essentially taken over the day-to-day operations of Blackwood Industries, making decisions that would have required Harrison's approval under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, Alexander had positioned himself as the protective son, shouldering the burden while his father focused on his health. Except the decisions Alexander was making would have made Harrison's younger self recoil in horror. There was the proposed merger with a Chinese manufacturing conglomerate that would have gutted the American workforce Harrison had spent decades building. There was the planned sale of the renewable energy division, the one Harrison considered his legacy project, the one that would matter long after he was gone, to a private equity firm known for asset stripping. And there were the parties. God, the parties. Marcus Finch had sent Harrison photographs, Alexander hosting investors at five-star restaurants, the bills running into six figures, Alexander taking potential clients to exclusive clubs, spending money like it was already his to burn. Alexander playing the role of the young billionaire heir, stepping into shoes that weren't yet his to fill. "He's telling people you've already stepped down," Marcus had reported during one of his private visits. "He's referring to himself as acting CEO and making promises about the company's direction that directly contradict everything you've built." Harrison had stared at those photographs for hours, studying his son's face, the confident smile, the easy charm, the complete absence of grief or concern. This was a man who'd been waiting for this moment, who saw his father's death not as a loss, but as an opportunity, a promotion, an inheritance that was taking too long to arrive. And the most devastating part? Alexander was good at it. The investors loved him. The board was warming to his vision. In some alternate universe where Harrison actually was dying, his son would have successfully dismantled everything he'd built within a year, and everyone would have applauded him for his innovation. But then there was Charlotte, and she was breaking Harrison's heart in an entirely different way. While Sophia calculated and Alexander schemed, Charlotte simply loved. She'd turned caregiving into a full-time occupation, learning about medications and symptoms, researching experimental treatments, sitting with her father through endless hours when the mansion fell silent and the weight of mortality, fake though it was, pressed down on everything. "Tell me about when you started the company," she had asked during those long afternoons, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his chair like she used to when she was a child. "Tell me about the first office, the first client, the first time you thought you might actually succeed." And Harrison would tell her, watching her face as she listened, seeing genuine interest and love and connection in her eyes. She wasn't thinking about inheritance or equity or market positioning. She was trying to know her father before she lost him, trying to collect memories the way other people collect photographs. The guilt was crushing. Every time Charlotte sacrificed another piece of her life to be present for his fictional death, Harrison felt the weight of his deception grow heavier. She'd broken up with her boyfriend of 2 years. "I don't have time for a relationship right now. Dad needs me." She'd taken a leave of absence from her job at a nonprofit she'd been passionate about. They understand. Family comes first. She'd stopped seeing her friends, stopped pursuing her own dreams, stopped living her own life. All for a lie. All for a test she didn't know she was taking. All while her mother planned liquidation strategies and her brother played pretend CEO with the family fortune. The irony wasn't lost on Harrison. He'd designed this test to discover who truly loved him, but in the process, he was destroying the one person whose love had never been in question. Charlotte was paying the price for her siblings' greed, suffering because she was genuine in a family of performers. It was week 5 when Harrison began to question everything. The family had gathered for what Sophia insisted on calling a celebration of life, a grotesque dinner party where relatives and close family friends could say goodbye to Harrison while he was still alive to hear it. The whole thing had felt like a funeral rehearsal, with Harrison cast in the unsettling role of his own ghost. But something unexpected happened. During the dinner, with 30 people gathered around the extended dining table, Alexander had stood and given a speech that sounded almost genuine. He'd talked about his father's legacy, about the lessons learned, about the man behind the billions. His voice had cracked, actually cracked, when he mentioned childhood memories of weekend fishing trips and late-night conversations in the study. Sophia had held Harrison's hand throughout the entire meal, her grip firm and present in a way it hadn't been in years. She'd laughed at his jokes, finished his sentences, played the role of the devoted wife with such conviction that Harrison found himself wondering if he'd been wrong. If perhaps the stress of his diagnosis had brought out protective instincts rather than revealing predatory ones. For one dangerous, hopeful moment, Harrison Blackwood allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his family did love him, that the conversations he'd overheard were taken out of context, that Sophia's liquidation plans were just practical preparation, not eager anticipation, that Alexander's aggressive takeover of the company was filial duty, not opportunistic theft. That night, lying in bed, Harrison seriously considered calling off the entire test, admitting the truth, apologizing for the deception, and accepting that his family, flawed as they might be, did care about him in their own complicated way. He was reaching for his phone to call Dr. Maxwell when he heard it, voices drifting up from the first-floor parlor, celebratory and unguarded. He shouldn't have left his bed. He should have stayed in his room, preserved that fragile hope, maintained the comfortable illusion. But Harrison Blackwood had built an empire by facing uncomfortable truths, and some habits die harder than fictional cancers. He made his way down the stairs, his movements genuinely slow now from weeks of manufactured illness, and stood in the same shadow where this entire nightmare had begun. And there they were, Sophia and Alexander, crystal champagne flutes in hand, toasting in the empty parlor, while upstairs the man they'd just eulogized supposedly slept. 5 weeks. Down, maybe 8 to go, Alexander said, his voice light with relief. Did you see how he struggled with the stairs tonight? Dr. Maxwell says the decline will accelerate now. Sophia's laugh was soft, almost musical. Tonight was perfect. Everyone saw how devoted we are, how united the family is. When the time comes, there won't be any questions about the transition. She paused, taking a delicate sip of champagne that cost $3,000 a bottle. I've already had preliminary conversations with Sotheby's about the art collection. They're estimating $70 million for the 20th century pieces alone. Mother, forget the art. I'm talking about restructuring the entire corporate portfolio. Once I have controlling interest, You'll have controlling interest, Sophia interrupted, her voice sharp with sudden authority. Don't forget that I own 40% through the trust. You and Charlotte split the rest. Which means, darling boy, that you'll need my vote for any major decisions. The silence that followed was electric with tension, with the sudden realization that even within the conspiracy, there were power struggles waiting to emerge, mother and son already negotiating the division of spoils from a man who wasn't even dead yet. Harrison stood frozen in that hallway, his hand gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles went white. The hope that had bloomed during dinner withered and died in the space of a single overheard conversation. They hadn't changed. If anything, they'd gotten better at performing. The speech, the hand-holding, the emotion, all of it had been theater. A dress rehearsal for the grief they'd need to perform when the real death came. They were practicing their roles as devoted family members the same way Alexander practiced his presentations to the board, refining and perfecting until the performance was flawless. And in that moment, standing alone in the dark while his wife and son celebrated his approaching demise with champagne and liquidation plans, Harrison Blackwood felt something inside him fundamentally shift. This was no longer about testing his family. This was about protecting the one person who'd proven herself worthy, Charlotte, and ensuring that the vultures circling his deathbed would never get their claws into what he'd built. The next 3 weeks were brutal. Harrison stopped pulling his punches in the performance. If they wanted a dying man, he'd give them one. He lost more weight, developed a convincing tremor in his hands, started using a cane, fell once, deliberately, on the stairs, creating enough drama that Dr. Maxwell had to be called, maintaining the fiction while Harrison watched his family's reactions with a scientist's detachment. Sophia's visits dropped to 5 minutes, then 3. Then eventually she'd just send Charlotte to check on him. Alexander stopped visiting entirely, too busy with the company, or more accurately, too busy dismantling it, piece by piece. Only Charlotte remained constant, her devotion unwavering even as the burden grew heavier, even as her own life disappeared into the black hole of caregiving. Harrison watched her sacrifice everything, and his guilt became a physical presence in the room, a weight pressing down on his chest that had nothing to do with fictional cancer, and everything to do with the realization that he'd created a test that punished the innocent while the guilty flourished. Late at night, when Charlotte had finally retreated to her room exhausted, Harrison would lie awake and wonder if he'd become the villain in his own story. If his need to expose the truth had transformed him into something as calculating and cold as the family members he was testing. If the empire he'd built had required him to sacrifice so much of his humanity that he could orchestrate this kind of elaborate deception without flinching. The documents Marcus kept bringing him to sign, the ones that would disinherit Sophia and Alexander, that would leave everything to Charlotte, sat on his desk untouched, because signing them would make it real, would mean accepting that his family was truly broken beyond repair, would mean acknowledging that he'd been sleeping beside a stranger for 43 years and raised a son who saw him as an obstacle rather than a father. It was week 8 when Harrison hit his lowest point. Charlotte had been with him constantly for almost 2 months now. Her boyfriend was gone, her job was gone, her friends had stopped calling, her entire identity had been consumed by the role of caregiver to a man who wasn't actually dying. She'd lost weight too, real weight, not the calculated kind Harrison had manufactured. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. Her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. And one afternoon, sitting beside his chair while he pretended to sleep, Harrison heard her crying. Soft, heartbroken sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand, the kind of grief that comes from watching someone you love slip away. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered to herself, or perhaps to God, or perhaps to the universe that had decided to test her in this cruel way. "I don't know how to let you go, Dad. I don't know how to exist in a world where you don't." And Harrison, maintaining his performance even as his own heart shattered, kept his eyes closed and his breathing steady, and let his daughter grieve for a death that wasn't coming. In that moment, he hated himself more than he'd ever hated Sophia's calculating betrayal or Alexander's ambitious theft, because they were predators doing what predators do. But he was something worse. He was the architect of his daughter's suffering, the engineer of a test that proved her loyalty by destroying her life. That night, alone in his study, Harrison Blackwood made a decision. The test was over. He had his answer. Charlotte had proven herself, beyond any doubt, and Sophia and Alexander had revealed their true natures with equal clarity. It was time to end the performance, call the family together, and reveal the truth. He picked up his phone to call Marcus to set in motion the final act of this domestic tragedy. But before he could dial, he heard footsteps in the hallway, 2 sets moving quietly, trying not to be heard. He put down the phone and moved to the door, that old familiar position in the shadows where this entire nightmare had begun. Sophia and Alexander stood in the foyer, their voices low but urgent, and what Harrison heard in the next 60 seconds would change everything. "The doctor says it could be any day now," Alexander was saying, his tone businesslike, discussing his father's death the way other people discuss weather. "We need to be ready to move quickly. I've already drafted the press release announcing my permanent position as CEO. And I've finalized the asset liquidation strategy," Sophia added. "The moment the death certificate is filed, we start executing. Harrison was too sentimental about the company, too attached to legacy and loyalty. It's time to extract maximum value and—" She stopped abruptly. Both of them froze, staring at something beyond Harrison's line of sight. And then he heard it. Charlotte's voice, sharp with fury he'd never heard from his gentle daughter before. "What did you just say?" The confrontation that followed would haunt Harrison for the rest of his life. Charlotte, pushed beyond her breaking point, finally seeing her mother and brother clearly for the first time. The accusations, the denials, the ugly truth spilling out into the marble foyer of a mansion built on ambition and now collapsing under the weight of greed. And Harrison Blackwood, standing in his study, realized that the test had taken on a life of its own, that Charlotte wasn't going to wait for his dramatic revelation, that the truth was coming out right now, in real time, and he had a choice to make. Did he reveal himself now, step into that foyer and admit that his death was a fiction, his weakness a performance? Or did he let Charlotte fight this battle alone, let her discover the truth about her family in the cruelest way possible, by defending a father who was deceiving everyone, including her? The question isn't just what Harrison should do. The question is, What would you do if your entire family's true nature was being exposed in real time and you held the power to end the deception, but only by revealing that you'd been manipulating everyone all along, including the one person whose love was never in doubt? So what does a billionaire do when the test he designed spirals out of control? When the daughter he's been protecting is about to discover that everyone in her family, including him, has been lying to her? Harrison Blackwood had exactly 30 seconds to decide whether to reveal himself or let the confrontation play out, and that decision would define not just his legacy, but the future of everyone standing in that marble foyer. Harrison didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the shadows, his cane clicking against marble floors with deliberate authority, and for the first time in 8 weeks, he stood straight. No tremor in his hands, no weakness in his posture, just a 72-year-old man who'd built an empire from nothing, reclaiming the power he'd been performing away. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. 3 faces turned toward him in perfect synchronization. Sophia's shock, Alexander's confusion, and Charlotte's desperate hope that somehow her father had miraculously recovered. The silence that followed was the kind that exists in the moment before thunder, when lightning has already struck but the sound hasn't caught up yet. "Dad?" Charlotte's voice was small, broken, everything Harrison had feared it would be. How are you standing? Dr. Maxwell said exactly what I told him to say." Harrison moved into the foyer's light, and with each step he shed the costume of the dying patriarch he'd worn for 2 months. "There is no cancer, Charlotte. There never was." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Harrison watched his daughter's face cycle through confusion, relief, disbelief, and then something that made his chest constrict. Betrayal. Pure, devastating betrayal. "What?" It was barely a whisper. "I faked it. The diagnosis, the weakness, the medication, all of it was theater, a test." Harrison's voice remained steady even as he watched Charlotte's world collapse in real time. "I needed to know who in this family actually loved me versus who was simply waiting for me to die so they could divide up my fortune." Sophia found her voice first, her shock morphing into defensive outrage. "You did what? Harrison, do you have any idea what you've put us through? The stress, the grief, the liquidation plans?" Harrison turned to his wife with eyes that had negotiated billion-dollar deals and could see through any performance. The conversations with Sotheby's about my art collection, the preliminary calls with Marcus about ensuring your financial position. Spare me the performance, Sophia. I've heard every word you never meant me to hear. Her face went pale, the mask of the devoted wife finally cracking completely. Alexander stepped forward, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "You spied on us? You manipulated us? What gives you the right?" "I'm your father," Harrison interrupted, and for the first time in 8 weeks, genuine emotion crept into his voice. "What gives me the right is 43 years of marriage and a lifetime of building something I thought would matter to my family. What gives me the right is discovering that my wife and son were toasting my death with champagne while planning how quickly they could dismantle everything I've built. We weren't." Alexander's protests died under his father's unwavering gaze. The young man who'd been playing CEO for 8 weeks suddenly looked like what he was. A child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except the cookies were worth $3 billion. Charlotte's voice cut through the accusations like a scalpel through flesh. "And me?" She was trembling now, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold the pieces together. "What about me, Dad? Was I part of your test too?" This was the moment Harrison had been dreading, the moment when he had to face the collateral damage of his elaborate deception. "Charlotte, I gave up everything." Her voice was rising now, 2 months of sacrifice and exhaustion and genuine grief pouring out. "I left my job. I ended my relationship. I spent every single day watching you die, holding your hand, trying to memorize every detail of your face because I thought I was losing you. And you're telling me it was all a lie? That you were watching me suffer to prove some kind of point?" "You were never the one I doubted," Harrison said softly. And there it was. the guilt he'd been carrying for 8 weeks finally given voice. You proved yourself in the first 5 minutes, Charlotte. Every day after that, I watched you sacrifice your life for mine, and every day I hated myself more for putting you through it. Then why didn't you stop? Tears were streaming down her face now, and Harrison realized that while he'd been so focused on exposing Sophia and Alexander's greed, he'd broken something precious in his daughter. If you knew I loved you, why did you let me keep suffering? The question hung between them, and Harrison didn't have a good answer. Because the truth was complicated and uncomfortable. He'd been so consumed with gathering evidence against Sophia and Alexander, so focused on confirming his worst suspicions, that he'd sacrificed Charlotte's well-being on the altar of his need to be proven right. Because I needed to be sure, he said finally, knowing how inadequate it sounded. Because I needed evidence that would hold up when I did this. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, the one Marcus had prepared weeks ago. Sophia, Alexander, as of today, you're both disinherited. The house, the companies, the investments, the art collection, all of it goes to Charlotte. You'll each receive a stipend sufficient to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, but you'll never control a single asset of mine again. The explosion was immediate. Sophia's carefully maintained composure shattered into fury. Alexander's protests became threats of legal action. But Harrison had spent 50 years in boardrooms with the best lawyers money could buy, and every document was ironclad, every decision legally unassailable. They could fight it, but they'd lose, and somewhere beneath their outrage, they knew it. "Get out," Harrison said quietly, and the authority in his voice was the same one that had closed billion-dollar deals and fired executives who thought they were untouchable. "Both of you, pack what you need tonight. Marcus will be in touch about the financial arrangements." And here's what's remarkable about the truly entitled. They left. Not gracefully, not quietly, but they left. Sophia with threats about what her lawyers would do. Alexander with promises that this wasn't over. But within 20 minutes, the mansion that had housed this domestic tragedy fell silent, and only Harrison and Charlotte remained in the foyer where everything had finally come to light. Charlotte stood motionless, her face a canvas of emotions Harrison couldn't fully read. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. "I don't want it. Charlotte, I don't want your money, your companies, your test-passing prize for being the daughter who actually loved you." She looked at him with eyes that held something worse than anger, disappointment. "You think you revealed their true nature, but you know what you actually did? You revealed yours. You're just as manipulative as they are greedy. The only difference is you think your manipulation was justified." The words hit harder than any of Sophia's calculated betrayals or Alexander's ambitious theft. Because Charlotte was right. In his quest to expose his family's corruption, Harrison had become corrupted himself. He'd manipulated everyone, including the one person whose love had never been transactional. "So what do I do?" Harrison asked, and for the first time in 50 years, he genuinely didn't know the answer. "How do I fix this?" Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd just grown up in the space of a single evening. "You don't fix it, Dad. You live with it. You accept that you got your answer. I love you. They don't. And now we all have to figure out what comes next." She paused at the doorway, looking back at the father she'd sacrificed everything for. "I'm going home. My real home. Don't call me for a while. I need time to figure out if I can forgive you for this." And then she was gone, and Harrison Blackwood stood alone in his mansion worth 40,000 square feet, surrounded by art worth $70 million, heir to a fortune worth $3 billion, and utterly, completely alone. But here's the thing about stories. They don't end where we expect them to. 6 months after the revelation, Harrison sat in a modest coffee shop in Brooklyn, waiting. He'd sold the mansion, restructured the company with independent board oversight, donated $1 billion to causes Charlotte cared about. Not as payment, not as apology, but as action, the only language he'd ever really understood. When Charlotte walked in, Harrison felt his heart stutter in a way that had nothing to do with fictional cancer and everything to do with genuine hope. She slid into the seat across from him, older somehow, stronger, changed by the test she'd never asked to take. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart." They talked for 3 hours, not about money or inheritance or the family that had fractured beyond repair. They talked about Charlotte's new job at an environmental nonprofit, about Harrison's genuine health struggles, real ones this time, the kind that come from actual aging. They talked about forgiveness, about the difference between love and manipulation, about how to rebuild trust when the foundation has been shattered. It wasn't fixed. It might never be fully fixed, but it was real. And after a lifetime of performances and calculations and tests, real was enough. Harrison learned that the true wealth wasn't in the empire he'd built or the fortune he'd accumulated. It was in the quiet afternoon, in a Brooklyn coffee shop with a daughter who'd chosen, despite everything, to give him another chance. Not because of his money, not because of inheritance, but because somewhere beneath the manipulative test and the elaborate deception, she still loved the man he used to be and hoped he could become again. So here's the question this story leaves us with, and I want you to really think about this. In a world where wealth can buy almost anything, how do you measure the value of genuine love? Harrison Blackwood spent 8 weeks and risked everything to answer that question, and the cost was almost more than he could bear. He got his answer, but the answer came with a price tag that no amount of billions could cover. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have done what Harrison did? If you suspected your family only loved you for your money, would you have the courage to test them, knowing you might lose everything in the process? Or is there a better way to find out who really stands by you when everything else falls away? And if this story made you think, made you question, made you feel something, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the truth is, we're all testing each other in small ways every day. The only question is whether we're brave enough to face what those tests reveal. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next story.